Thank you for joining us for Hope Springs Eternal. I'm Pastor Jay Jackson.
I'm Ricky Ricks.
Katie Lamert.
We're the three of the pastors here at First United Methodist Church in Longview. And if you've been checking out our podcast, you know that we bring a variety of perspectives on how we as United Methodists approach the Christian faith. And today, we're going to be building off of last week's podcast with regards to the general rules of the United Societies of the United Methodist Church, part of our doctrinal standards, and talking about the first of three primary, if you will, what would you call them? Encouragements, aspects, litmus tests of the general rules of the church to do no harm, which I personally think is the hardest of the three. We're going to be talking about what does it mean to do no harm, and why was that such an important part of this small group accountability ministry that was formed in 1739 by John Wesley in response to a small group of men. It just happened to be men who were looking for it. They were definitely fearful of the wrath to come and seeking to find a pathway to salvation. And Wesley started meeting with them weekly and made them commit to these three tenets of participation in one of those groups. And it took off like wildfire. That people were flocking to be a part of this process of accountability that Wesley started. And today, we're going to be talking about the first premise, which I think is one that we need to recapture today. What does it mean to not do harm? Ricky, what does it mean for us today to commit to not doing harm?
The first thing that comes to my mind is that we will treat each other with respect, that we will see each other in religious terms as children of God. We'll see each other as people who are decision makers, people who all have feelings, both positive and negative, and that we will be aware of that, and that, I mean, fundamental to me is that we are going to treat each other as people of value.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is terribly hard because, like lots of times, we want to save people thinking we're doing good. And sometimes what we really need is to give people a safe place to be people,
Okay.
and to nurture that.
Okay.
So I'd start with respect.
Yeah. Katie, what would you add?
I mean, I think Wesley summed it up well with the question of that we ought to be examining and intentionally asking ourselves, well, would this word, would this action, would the choices that I'm making, any given choice, would this hurt someone? And if so, it should not be done. It would be doing harm, and so do no harm. And he was all about that being the baseline, the foundation, the start of that. And I think that's really important too. It's a preemptive move, and it takes intentionality. And so I do think it takes seeing people in the eyes of God, seeing people with dignity and worth and value. But I also think it takes a lot of intentionality on our own part of stopping ourselves. And it's great to do good. That's the fun one. We all love that one, the doing good part. But the doing no harm takes a lot more of that front work and thinking things all the way through. And so I think it takes a lot of that self-examination that we can't, I think Wesley said, we can't seek to be in Christian community with each other. We can't seek to love. if we're harming one another. And
Mhm.
so I think that that was really significant that, he had the wherewithal to put that as the first one, to do
Mhm.
no harm. And that it wasn't just in what we were doing, but what we're not doing. That you can't stay silent on injustices. That you
Mhm.
can't sit idly by and let things happen around you. That you can't store up hatred in your heart. I mean, he was so big on not just your actions that you did, but the way
Mhm.
you even thought. And
Mhm.
it reminds me of Jesus. Of Jesus
Right.
saying, if you even think about this thing, um, you're liable to be guilty of
Yeah.
hatred, and
Yeah.
that is hard.
Doing no harm doesn't mean don't do anything.
Right.
In
Yeah.
fact, some of the greatest harm is when we stand pat when harm is being
Right.
done to somebody else. I found it really interesting when I was going through the Book of Discipline and its recollection. By the way, if you would like to look this up, just ask for the Book of Discipline. It has been a part of it for as long as I can remember as a part of our doctrinal standards, and you will find these general rules for United Societies as a part of our doctrinal standards. And what I found interesting, because I approach it from the same kind of way, this is about our relationship one with another. But the first things that are pointed out there are the ways in which we do harm to God in our relationship with God.
Mm.
Don't profane the name of the Lord. Don't take the name of God in vain. These aspects of how we actually harm our relationship with God by the way in which we do this and lead others to similarly bad behavior, as well as the harm we do to ourselves, not just in avoiding drunkenness as a means of giving better example to others, but not harming our own bodies, not harming our own souls, not harming our own um, well-being. And we can get into the things that are extreme in that area, but as somebody who struggled with excessive eating and weight gain, I've done harm to my own health and my well-being, the place where God seeks to dwell in my life, by the way, in which I've even done harm to myself in life. So this aspect of doing harm definitely has that relational component, one between one with one another, but to take it even back to how our relationship with God is harmed and our relationship internally with ourselves as a child of God is a part of this too, which I found deeply insightful to me.
Yeah.
These people who were looking to overcome a fear of separation from God, the first tenet of these groups was to do no harm. And gosh, there seems to be a lot of harm that we're doing to one another these days. I, how do we get to be so polarized? Ricky, what do you think? Why are we so harmful to one another?
I would think, I think this is as old as time itself, that uh, we let fear guide us.
Mm,
Um, we we try to insulate ourselves from change.
mm,
Um, the we have lost a sense of community.
mhm,
That there's a place for everyone, um, and and I don't know. I just think that change and um, that fear shows itself in all kinds of ways. We have to be right. Our side has to be right. Um, um, we have to win. Uh,
mhm,
uh, uh, Everything is about succeeding, and so that means that um, we live in this anxiousness or fear that somebody's going to take something from us, or we're not going to get something. So I think I would just begin with fear.
mhm.
What was it Kierkegaard said? Fear was a sickness and a trembling unto death. And I just think that that's true. And
Mhm,
um, it overtakes us. So,
mhm. I think fear is one of those key aspects of all this. Do you have another one that you'd like to share? I know for myself, I was thinking in terms of selfishness, the idea that we make ourselves into God rather than being a part of relationship with God, and and in that we start to be harmful to others by the way in which we have no compassion for others because we define the world by our own pleasures rather than in community. Selfishness would be another place I think that's a significant contributor. Anything impress upon you, Katie, that you would add to that?
I think power. I think
Mm,
everybody wants power, whether it's just personal power and autonomy and agency over their life to go a certain way. And if they
mhm,
perceive some other person or group of people or circumstance that is getting in the way of power or that would help them get to more power by oppressing, a group of people, uh, that can be very tempting.
mhm,
It's easy to we can see the big groups of people that have done this, um,
mhm,
oppressed people to gain power. I mean, this is how slavery started as chattel slavery.
mhm,
It wasn't about race or color of skin or anything like that. It was
mhm,
about money. It was about
mhm,
free labor and
mhm,
and making money off of people, literally. And and it's easy to see that in big systems, but it's harder to maybe see how we do that, how we perpetuate systems of this in our own
mhm.
lives, and any like little ounce of power that we have, how it kind of makes us want more.
Yeah.
And it's easy to fall into a trap of harming others by trying to protect the power that we have or by
Mhm.
seeking more.
Yeah, it could take a lot of different forms, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes the power of popularity
Yeah.
is just as much as the power of greed, right?
Hmm.
The sense of, as you use the word autonomy, control for ourselves, versus giving over to anything or anyone. Um, we have all kinds of different power struggles within our world. Some related by economic circumstance, some by innate social structures. Gosh, even within Christianity, we joke about you know our fellow Christians who worship or who practice their faith in ways that are even demeaning to fellow followers of Jesus Christ. And it really does become understandable that in this aspect of a ongoing group of accountability, that one needs to first and foremost see the other dynamics in a way that does not do harm if one is going to encourage and support and help one another along in a pathway. If you're there only for yourself, it's not going to work very well, um, even if that's your first initial motivation.
Hmm.
Most people don't go to a 12-step program or go into a group without some sort of sense of selfish desire for themselves. And at the same time, the best improvements we can make for ourselves are the ones that we share with others. And that sense of otherness, I think, really is important in this aspect of doing no harm. Um, it's hard because I really feel like there's this sort of overt sense of harm that we do out of malicious behavior, out of selfish behavior, out of power dynamics that we've uh, grasped onto. But I think also in an unwillingness to be real with one another, we do harm and allow harm to happen when we don't find gracious ways of speaking about the harm we've felt. We're afraid to talk, that hurt, or that felt um, disengaging, diminishing in some way. So so there takes a lot of trust on the person being harmed to be able to speak to that in a healthy way to help one understand how they can avoid doing harm. Um, I think sometimes that's as important as the intentionality of the individual and their participation is being able to identify those situations and speak to them.
And I think too, it's not just not doing the actual harm, but it's in perpetuating harm. I mean, if you've seen a harm done and you're unwilling to respond to it, even if it wasn't your fault, even if you didn't do the initial harm. I mean, we think about the story of the Good Samaritan, which I've heard different interpretations of, and one of my favorite ones is a scholar, a theologian, who's said that their interpretation of that story is that all of sin is a failure to bother to love,
Mhm.
and that the highlight of the story is not on the people who robbed and beat and almost murdered this man who was
Mhm.
left in the ditch, but it's on the people that passed by, on the priest and on the Levite who passed by, and they didn't do the harm. They didn't do the actual robbing and beating and the malicious evil like you're
Mhm.
talking about.
It's the passivity of not responding
Right.
compassionately,
But
right?
they didn't bother to love. And so part of doing no harm is stepping in when you've seen a harm, when you've witnessed. And I think so many of us, and I know I've experienced this when I've voiced up or come to express something that has hurt me, and and people or places or entities have said, they refuse to say sorry. They refuse any sort of language that would imply liability on their end, that they were the ones that did it. And one time in an email between me and somebody, I just said, I wish somebody would just say, I'm sorry. You know, you're so
Mhm.
worried about being implicated here.
Mhm.
And all I'm asking for is some sympathy, is some connection, is some empathy
Mhm.
as a human being. You know, and I think all of us, when African American people talk about the plight of slavery and the suffering there and the ongoing, people, white people nowadays say, well, I didn't do it, I didn't own a plantation. And it's like nobody's asking you to say that you did. You know,
Mhm.
they're asking you to do no more harm, and the United Methodist said that at our last conference, you know, do no more harm. And
Mhm.
I think all of us probably could step into that, that there's part
Mhm.
of doing no harm that is a failure to bother to love. And um and to me there's hope in all of that, that it's just like getting over my laziness, you know, um that I can apologize for things that I had no part in doing, that I wasn't alive for,
Mhm.
the you know, the harm that started, that was initiated, but I can still do a part. I can play a part in the
Mhm.
reconciliation, in the
Mhm.
unharm, in the love. And to me, that's so much better than worrying about, well, they're going to think that I owned a plantation. You know, no, who cares?
Mhm.
I can be part of this beautiful, and all of us can as disciples, this beautiful reconciliation.
Yeah. I've had people when I've said, "Well, I'm sorry about that,"
Hmm.
and they said, "Well, you didn't do anything." But feeling sorry doesn't have to imply I'm sorry for what I've done.
Right,
I can be sorry for the
right.
circumstances that someone's empathy
Yes.
is embracing someone else's hurt and pain, whether you're the cause of it or not.
Hmm.
Um, and I think to have successful small group relationships, to have the right kind of healthy relationship with God, to have the right kind of self worth and self-love that we are called to have. We need to be honest and compassionate and empathetic to ourselves, to others, and without that, it will always keep a certain surface nature to it. If we're not able to dig down deep and get beyond those things. The small groups I've been a part of, I can look at the ones that are successful versus the ones that have been less successful. And somebody came to a point of vulnerability or spoke a word that was really hard for them to speak or for others to hear, that changed the depth of the dynamic because they were able to speak to something, whether they were talking about a harm that was done in their lives outside of it or something that happened within the group. It changed the dynamic when they were able to bring light to something that was hidden in our midst. When we're a little ultra careful to not speak to the harm that's being done, sometimes we're doing the harm of shallow interactions as well. At least that's what my experience has been. I have to say, Ricky, when you talked about competitiveness in that area, there was a time where I was driven absolutely, completely by perfection and win. That, I mean, it was whether it was a simple board game or athletic competition, it was all about winning. And even in times of victory on the court or on the field or in the game, I lost a whole lot more than I ever won by having it be so dominated by that than it wasn't about the interplay of relationship that was offered in that. I was missing the boat that friendly competition wasn't always about winning and losing. And now there are coaches who will tell you, even to this day, I don't care what anyone says, it's about W's. But we don't always win. But we can win in the way in which we win well and sometimes lose well, and sometimes grow personally and in relationship, whether we win or lose. And I think that's a hard thing for us. And I think it's more than just the participation ribbon type of thing, but I do think we should enjoy the opportunity as much as the victory and the way in which we look at our interactions in life, certainly in small group dynamics.
I think you can, things like winning, and you can still do with respect for the people with whom you're engaged in whatever. But I do think no matter that you always see the other people as having great significance. Well, just seeing them as people and seeing them as children of God. I remember a time when I was in band, and I was a pretty good percussionist. And there was a time when I knew that, and I knew that, and I knew that. And one day, the band director called me into his office, and he said, "Ricky, I'm going to tell you something that is going to make your life even better." And he looked at me, he said, "I want you to know that good drummers are a dime a dozen." And I was mad at him at first that he said that. But as I thought about that over my life, he didn't mean that as a demeaning thing. He meant that as a freeing thing. And I think that's what we should always be about, to look for that which is freeing for everyone.
Mhm.
I mean, I think a healthy relationship is something where we look at doing no harm to ourselves, we look at doing no harm to the community, and we look at doing, like you talked about, doing no harm in our relationship with God.
Yeah.
And that we're constantly, I like that word intentionality. We're constantly asking ourselves those questions about, what is it that does harm to my relationship with God?
Yeah.
What is it that does harm in my community, not in theoretical thing, but
Mhm.
in my community? And what am I doing that is doing harm to myself?
Right.
Um, those are good questions to ask. And
Yeah. And they're the kind of things that when we approach this honestly and with vulnerability, we can maybe find out that the issues are not in the harm that others have done to us, but the harm that's being done by us, in us. I, I think, stepping back for just a moment and thinking about the God basis for this, um, we profess that God is all powerful and can do anything, and yet chooses to be in relationship with imperfect people and to offer relationship, not coerce it. And that Jesus, even as he called the first disciples, did not go to the smartest, the most powerful. He went to those who were willing to say yes. Um, and God has constantly used less than ideal people to show the goodness and the power of God, um, but also to show that the measures of what we believe are goodness and giftedness are not the same measures that God uses. And I think there's just a freeing thing to that when we start to really understand the nature of how God seeks to do no harm in the relationship that God offers us, and to know that we're invited, and to be similarly willing to accept that and to offer it to others in like fashion. Um, I, what was it? W.C. Fields. I'd never want to be a part of a club that would have me. you know, we have a little bit of that kind of. I want to have a relationship into something that is beyond my capability or reach. Um, that says something about how we look at ourselves and how we're driven to something elusive in our lives. That's not how God works, and that's not how God guides us into relationship. It's a gracious, uplifting, restorative, redemptive kind of relationship, and that needs to start with us and God, and with ourselves, and seeing the other just as important as we see ourselves. That's not easy stuff. Not easy stuff at all. Um, Katie, people like to hear what you're thinking and saying more than me. I've been talking too much here. Um, in doing no harm, especially in group dynamic, what are the kind of things that you encourage in your youth ministry, in your pastoral ministry? Where are you trying to embody that, uh, and nurture that in the groups that you're leading, participating in?
I mean, I do think it starts with the call to see all humans made in the image of God, that we can't look at any person, any brother or sister, as anything less than what we see in ourselves. If everything was created in love, if God looked at every single person and breathed out life and said,
Mhm.
very good, very good. And if it was so good that he sent his only son to die for them, to me, I'm like, who am I to think anything lower than what God thinks about this person, no matter what they've done, no matter who they are, no matter how they think. And so and then it expands, and I love what Wesley does is that it always goes back to, I think, self-reflection on a very personal level of within my family, within my small group, within my workplace, my schools, my community, and then in my business, within the world. Um, how am I doing in doing no harm? And I think that's a hard question to ask ourselves.
Mhm.
In my neglect and my silence, how am I perpetuating injustice? And I was talking to somebody in our Sunday school class just the other day about this website that I buy clothes on. And they said,
Mhm.
"Where did you get your skirt?" And I said, "Well," they said, "I never know where to buy clothes." And I said, "Well, I got this on this website, but I have to stop using it because my mom told me that they have like child labor." And I was like, I said it like I was annoyed about it, because I am, because it
Mhm.
sells cheap clothes. And it's like, and they said, "Oh yeah, I've used that website too." But it's, you're right. I've heard the same thing, that they employ child labor. Um, and it was like, yeah, we probably shouldn't buy clothes there anymore. And yet the app is still on my phone. I haven't bought anything from it, but and we have to think about that. And then I have to think about where my children tell me, to be kinder and to use a softer voice. And I preach that about kindness, and yet I need to hear from my 4-year-old and my 6-year-old about where I've done harm.
Mhm.
And so it's global and it's
Mhm.
personal. Um,
Mhm.
and and I have to realize the places that I scroll past, war crimes that I should be bold enough to speak up against. And yet I don't. I just scroll on by because I would rather look at Great Danes on Instagram than
Mhm.
torn apart cities because of hatred that has
By
just
the way,
gone
she's
on.
talking about dogs, not people from Europe.
Yes, the dogs, of which one I have. Um, but I just think, and I will say that the place that I've gotten the most pushback in my ministry, in both youth ministry and adult ministry, has been on my very extreme stance of pacifism, extreme
Mhm.
pacifism. In my youth group, this came up recently in a small group with boys, where they were talking about a physical fight that happened at school, and I was saying, okay, well, what would the Holy Spirit tell you to do? We were talking about the guidance of the Holy Spirit that night, and they were just like, don't throw the first punch, but I can throw the second punch, and I was like, is that what the Holy Spirit would tell you to do? And they were like, "That's what my parents told me to do." I was like, "Well, let's talk about it.
Mhm.
Like, what else could you do? What nonviolent act could you do?" Um,
Mhm.
and it was just this, conversation that they were just like, "Whoa, we've never heard." Of course, they've heard the thought of walk away, tell a teacher kind of thing,
Mhm.
but they were just like, "No, my parents told me I could defend myself," and and so this thought of, well, I'm not telling you not to defend you. I'm not telling you to get beat up
Mhm.
or to submit yourself to constant abuse. Um, but I am saying, and so I read that, turn the other cheek. And, fifth grade, sixth grade boys took that in a very weird direction. And
Mhm.
I got very weird stories after that. But even talking to adults about those
Mhm.
verses have been places of great pushback. And Michael's been like, Katie, that's just not Texas justice. People in Texas just,
Mhm.
they do justice like this. And I'm like, yeah, but, Jesus was an extreme pacifist.
Mhm.
And when he disarmed Peter, Bonhoeffer would say he disarmed us all. Um, and I believe that, and I'm not perfect at that, but I want to believe it.
Mhm.
And so, and I think that that's a call to do no harm, that we can't give money to, we can't, in the way that we vote, in the way that we speak, in the way that we treat our children, and in any way perpetuate these things that do physical and bodily or mental verbal harm to others. And I'm not saying I'm perfect at that. I'm very far from it, but I have gotten a lot of pushback on that.
Mhm. It's not in keeping with many social norms and with our most innate reflexes of how we, want to respond. Um, Self-control
Mhm.
is one of those fruits of the spirit that everybody wants in somebody else, but is more difficult when we have to be confronted with where we need self-control. And I think it was wise to have doing no harm as the first step because it even changes the way in which we seek to do good. And
Mhm.
as we turn the conversation toward that in our next episode, I think it'll be well served for people to have seen this episode and to think about the things about how we do harm to our relationship with God, to our own self, to others in relationship with us. That before we can begin to look at that second tenet of the general rules, that we need to start with not doing harm if we are really going to be effective in doing good. And so we hope that you'll come back and join us for uh, part two of our three-part look into the general rules of the United Methodist Church's United Societies and a part of our doctrinal heritage. Until next week, do no harm, and may hope spring eternal.